Welcome to the Borgen Project Podcast. Our guest today has one of the most interesting backgrounds I can imagine when it comes to discussing Gaza with us. He's been called by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They've cited him as one of the world's leading specialists on genocide. He was born and raised in Israel, where he served in the Israeli military, operating out of a command post in Gaza during the 70s. He is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Professor Omer Bartov, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so let's get started with the. I'm definitely curious about the your start growing up in Israel, and then what your views were like towards Palestinians growing up as a kid, and then kind of your experience serving in the military, and how that shaped your views on the situation.
Well, yeah, that's a long story. So, I was born and raised in Israel. I did live as a child for a couple of years in the United States and as a teenager for a couple of years in the UK. So I also had other experiences, but most of my childhood was spent in Israel. And in 1972, I joined the IDF as well and served there for 4 years. You know, growing up, we didn't know much about Palestinians. We Meeting Arabs, as we called them at the time, was really sometimes you'd go to what was called an Oriental restaurant. So you'd go and eat Arabic food in Jaffa. But otherwise, we grew up among ourselves. It was only subsequently that I discovered that two childhood neighborhoods that I had lived in central Tel Aviv, sort of northern part of central Tel Aviv, and then further north, where now the University of Tel Aviv is, had been Palestinian villages. And there were some houses left there. We used to play in them. We had a vague idea that there had been Palestinians living there at some point, but nobody really talked about it. And it was only years later that I started thinking about it. I think many members of my generation started thinking about what happened just before we were born. I was born in 1954. The Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians, was part of the War of 1948. I also grew up surrounded by Holocaust survivors. So many people around me, older people, but not that old, had numbers on their forearms. There were languages spoken around me that I didn't understand, Polish and Yiddish. But all of this, I think we took as natural. It was just the environment we grew up in, and the land was ours because we were born in it. So all of this started sort of percolating up to one's awareness only years later. And then in the army, my army service included a great deal of patrolling along the borders. And then there was a period of about a year that I spent in the northern Sinai, and the battalion command was in Gaza, so we would go often to Gaza. That was 1974, 1975. Gaza was then very crowded, but it had about 350,000 people in it. And now Gaza has about 2 million, over 2 million. Wow. And before that, we experienced the war of 1973, and that war came to mind again on October 7th, 2023, exactly 50 years later, because both events were quite shocking and unanticipated. And the first one I experienced as a soldier, as a young soldier, and the second one, well, I was actually already in the United States and watching it from here.
Okay. So let's get into the kind of that now. So we're I guess a little over 6 months into the war. And genocide is obviously legally very difficult to prove compared to other war crimes. In November, you had an op-ed in the New York Times where you said it was likely that Israel was committing war crimes in Gaza, but at that early stage of the war, you didn't think there was enough proof to call it genocide. We're several months into the war now, and obviously a lot more military operations have gone underway. At this point, what's kind of your views on how the response has been, and is it looking like genocide at this stage of the game for you or not?
So look, I mean, for one thing, clearly, I think by now, one can say, although, we don't have enough facts, I certainly rely on reports by various news media. But as far as one can tell, there've clearly been war crimes committed by the IDF. Whether they will actually end up being investigated and whether people will pay a price for that is, that's more of a political issue. But there's a lot of evidence of war crimes. The question of genocide is, as you said, it's very hard to prove because you have to show both intent to destroy a particular group as such, and then you have to show that that intent was implemented in whole or in part. And that calls for a lot of documentation. And that documentation is hard to find, to acquire, and it takes a long time to go through it. So it is now being adjudicated by the ICJ, by the International Court of Justice. My own sense is that we are now at a point where there's several signs of this being either a genocidal operation or one that is right on the brink of that. One is the massive displacement of population, which is continuing as we speak, because now the population that has been displaced is being displaced for a second or third time already. And these
Right.
displacements are extremely costly in lives. And the second is that there has been a deprivation of means of survival, of clean water, of food, which clearly has been limited greatly by the Israeli authorities. So it's a starvation policy, and the goal of it, at least by announcement by various political figures in Israel, is to encourage the population to leave. If the population leaves, or if the population cannot leave and is subjected to this kind of intended deprivation of resources, of the means to stay alive, then this is beginning to look like genocide. So I think there's still maybe a possibility that this will be reversed. I've been saying that for a while, but it doesn't seem to be happening. The direction is the opposite right now with the operation in Rafah, and I think that we are on the brink or have passed the brink to calling this genocide.
And for Palestinians, they can't really leave, can they? Are they allowed to cross? They're not allowed to cross at all the borders. Is that correct? Or...
No, they cannot, and the Egyptians have erected a new system, a wall and a system of defense to prevent them. But the question is, what would happen if tens of thousands of people tried to cross? I mean, would the Egyptian army shoot them down or let them in, to a limited degree? It's unclear. Egypt right now is extremely upset because Israel has taken over the Rafah crossing without coordinating it with the Egyptians. So now supplies coming in from that crossing also greatly limited, if happening at all, because the Egyptians have no control over that right now. It's in the hands of the Israelis. So all of this means that people are just caught up in this impossible situation. Images coming from there are horrifying. And I suspect that the reality is much worse than what we are seeing on the limited reporting that is coming in.
Yeah, that's something it'll be interesting to see, because they're not allowed. Journalists aren't really allowed in there. Kind of all the reporting we're getting is mostly from a handful of probably Al Jazeera and a few others. I'd imagine they might still be around there, but otherwise it's been pretty uncovered for the most part.
Yeah, and a large number of journalists have been killed, and
right.
whether it was
ever,
and whether this was intentional or not, the fact of the matter is that it's become very dangerous to report from there, more dangerous than anywhere else right now.
Yeah. What's it like to be you right now? So you're an expert in genocide and Holocaust studies. A lot of your work is focused around the Holocaust and the treatment of Jews, and then at the same time, the country you're from and born and cared about is engaged. And I say this as an American who we've definitely been involved in some interesting, dubious endeavors around the world. But yeah, what's it like, kind of squaring sort of your expertise on this subject with? I'm sure you still have many friends and family in Israel, and trying to just kind of navigate both worlds of.
It's very hard. I mean, the truth is that it is very hard. I mean, my own family, my daughter-in-law's family comes from Kibbutz Be'eri, and that's where over 100 people were murdered by Hamas. Members of her family were kidnapped, and some are still in Gaza. Have been there for 8 months. Many other friends of mine have been affected by what is going on. So that's very personal. I know, and quite a number of Palestinians, certainly Palestinians from Israel, who are Israeli citizens, and they're undergoing an extremely hard time. They're terrified of what is happening because the police has become very aggressive. The Minister of so-called internal security, as you know, is a well-known racist and terrorist himself, a settler and an extremely violent character, and the police has changed dramatically during these months. I think that most Israeli citizens feel more insecure than they have ever felt since 1948. On the other hand, many of my friends don't feel that I don't empathize with them sufficiently, and that my kind of views on what is going on and what the IDF is involved in, and the dire need to stop this kind of killing, reflects my own lack of empathy with their situation. And one has to understand that most Israelis, although they can easily get information about what's going on in Gaza, don't know it, and they don't want to know. And they have no empathy whatsoever for the Palestinians there. And to me, it's very hard to process, to see. And I'm not talking about right-wing extremists. I'm talking about people who are generally quite liberal.
Everyday people.
And so just seeing it as a citizen, as I'm still an Israeli citizen, I certainly believe in the right of Israel to exist. I'm not an anti-Zionist. But to see what is happening to the country and what the country is carrying out right now, and what the long-term consequences of this will be, is quite devastating.
Is that, with your genocide studies, is that a pretty common characteristic when a country is engaged in, genocide or war crimes for the general population, to just sort of, I don't know if denial is the right word, but just kind of not really want to think about it or pay attention to it, or they're sort of, I guess the part of this too is there's been obviously traumatic experience that's happened to Israel. The terrorist attacks were horrible, and there's that sense of need to get them, go get it, revenge or whatever you want to call it. But is that a pretty? What are the common characteristics, I guess you'd say, in the population of a country whose government is involved with questionable activities?
Well, I think there is denial, and so there is lack of interest. But beyond that, and I think you can see it in many other cases of genocide, the people who are perpetrating these events see themselves as victims. One of the most powerful sentiments is not simply revenge, but even more crucially, I think, a sense of victimhood. So when you say to people, look what your army, your police, your representatives are doing, they say, but we are the victims. We were attacked. What they are doing is simply retaliating. And if we don't do that now, then what happened to us will happen again and again. And therefore, we must do it. But we don't want to know exactly what we're doing. Don't tell us too much about it. You have to destroy the enemy. Let's not talk about it too much, and let's make sure that they're gone. So there is both denial and knowledge, and a sense of self-justification, which is based on a sense of victimhood. And that's a very empowering sentiment when you feel you are the real victim. And those who attack you, those who criticize you, they don't understand that. And you cannot understand why they can't understand that you are the real victim. Why are they criticizing you and not your enemy? And specifically in Israel now, in the media, on a daily basis, when you mention Hamas, you say Hamas Nazis. They are the Nazis. So within the specific Israeli context, when you speak, it's not simply that they victimized us, say, on October 7th, which was a horrific massacre, but they are associated directly with the Nazis. They are the new Nazis, and you have to do to them what the Allies did to the Nazis. You have to destroy them totally.
Yeah. And I guess I never thought of it fully, but yeah, it does make a lot of sense that the victim part of it is, because I think of most every genocide or war crime type stuff, it really does start with that sense of you were either attacked or you thought you were going to be attacked. Or there's some sense of you've been wronged and must correct this right. Give me your thoughts. So you were a soldier in the Israeli military, and do you think the way the war is being conducted is consistent with actually trying to find the hostages? Because it sort of seems to me if Hamas has your hostages and then you're bombing all these Hamas targets, you're potentially bombing your hostages. Do you think they could have done like more of a special ops, heavy intelligence sort of operation, or is this kind of is what it is in terms of trying to get the hostages back?
So I'll say, first of all, I was a soldier and an officer and a company commander, and so I had some experience with that. But I also, in my early years, I was a military historian, so I studied various wars, including some of Israel's wars and Germany's wars. The most devastating war in history, which was the war conducted on the Eastern Front by Germany against the Red Army. Looking at what the Israeli army is doing, there have been two major fiascos. The first was October 7th. It's an unbelievable fiasco. It's really hard to fathom. It takes 90 minutes to drive from Tel Aviv to Kibbutz Be'eri. It took the army about 8 hours to get there. I mean, you just cannot fathom it.
It just doesn't make sense.
It just makes no sense whatsoever. So it turns out, of course, that the knowledge was there, the intelligence was there. There were female soldiers, observers, who were reporting that they saw Hamas training. And the commander said, yeah, sure. I mean, don't bother us with this news. We know that they can't do it. They're incapable of launching a major attack, which is very similar to what happened on October 6th, 1973. So this was the first fiasco. But the second fiasco is the Israeli operation. It's a terrible operation. It's hard to come up with an example of a worse operation in modern times since 1945. I mean, I simply can't understand it. Uh, they pushed from the north, and so obviously what they did is they pushed Hamas more and more to the south, and they destroyed everything on the way. What they did was expand a tactic that was developed by the IDF for operations in Gaza, limited operations, the largest of which was in 2014, to a strip-wide operation to the entire area, which created an immense amount of damage to structures and to people. And they have not accomplished, we are now into the 8th month, they've not accomplished the two stated goals. One goal was to destroy Hamas. Hamas is still fighting, and Israeli soldiers are dying every day. And two, to release the hostages. They have not released the hostages. They managed to release 3 hostages. All the other hostages were in an exchange, which could have been continued had the government agreed to do it, but it wouldn't continue. And when you think that the IDF called up about 360,000 reservists, 1/3 troops with tanks, modern artillery, the best aircraft in the world, the best intelligence in the world, with drones, an enormous cloud of drones over Gaza, fighting against maybe 30,000 lightly armed militias. And it's 8 months and they haven't defeated them. It's again, it's unthinkable how badly this has been done. Now, regarding the hostages, clearly many of the hostages are now dead. We don't know how many, but many are. Probably more than half of them are already dead. Some are dead because they were old people or young children or sick. Some are dead because they were killed by Israeli bombing. And some or shooting. There were some who were actually released themselves and were shot by IDF soldiers, which is a whole other question. Why did that happen? And some because the IDF got very close to where they were being held, and then those who were holding them shot them before they fled. And so clearly the government, the current government, and the IDF carrying out its orders, whatever their rhetoric is, have not put the hostages as their first priority. The first priority is to destroy Hamas, and they literally don't care how many civilians die in the process. And the only control over that is the US. And that control is very loose, to say the least.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true, because really everything they're putting the Palestinians through, they're putting their own hostages through, right? Because if they're cutting off food and medical supplies, that's also going to have a huge impact on the people being held hostage. And I know there's been quite a few protests by families of hostage members over the conduct. Is that a common? And you mentioned you have family members that are affected by this as well. But are most hostage families pretty upset with the way that war has been conducted and not enough focus on getting the hostages back, or what's kind of the general sentiment there?
Yeah, so, for a long time, families of hostages were afraid to make too much noise. They were hoping that the army, the government was doing what it could. They trusted it to do it. And it turns out that they're also being told, don't make too much noise, it won't be good for your family members, which is, again, the
horrible
kind of
thing to say to people. Yeah,
absolutely. And then gradually the government started inciting the population against the hostage families, which is, these are the kind of tactics that you would have never seen in Israel before. This government is a uniquely odious government. And Israel has never had a bunch of people like that in power. Now, there are some families that are protesting to free the hostages, saying that should be the first priority. We can always fight Hamas, but our families are dying there right now. And there's a smaller group, who support the government. um, because they're also divided politically, obviously. There's another
Okay.
element that is not mentioned often, which is that most of the communities that were hit by the Hamas attack were kibbutzim, and they tend to be of the left. They are not people who voted for this government, and they're not seen by this government as people who would ever support them. And so there is a kind of divide that the government thinks, well, those are not really our members of our constituency. And there's a suspicion that they are trying to undermine the government because they belong to the other political camp. And all of this would never have happened under previous Israeli governments, however, bad or good they were. This kind of tactic used by politicians right now in Israel, and particularly by the prime minister, is extraordinary. And it has to do with the fact that for him, personally, entirely personally, the best thing that could happen is for the war to continue, because that's the only thing that keeps him in power. And everybody knows it. It's totally transparent, but nobody's doing anything about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So before the war, he had been charged with, I believe, it's fraud and corruption and different charges, and then he was trying to do a judicial override and had a huge protest against him. So it just seems he has zero incentive to end this. And I think in the U.S. we constantly hear, if Hamas just hands over the terrorists, this will, or the hostages, this will all be over. And in your opinion, is that remotely realistic, or is it just sort of Netanyahu has too much incentive to?
No, of course not, because the government itself says if they hand over the hostages, then we'll go and kill them all. So why would they hand over the hostages? And I'm not defending Hamas. I mean, I think it would be fine if all of them were killed, and even better if you could put them on trial and lock them up. But if you want to free hostages and you say, give us the hostages and then we'll kill you, then obviously you're not going to get them back, meaning you don't want them back. You want the situation to continue. So saying that if they gave back the hostages, everything would end, the Israeli government says it will not end. We will eradicate all of them. And it has also not presented any plan whatsoever for what it will do next. It's refusing to do that. In fact, yesterday, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Gallant, said publicly, he called a news conference, and he said the fact that the government, of which he's a member, meaning the prime minister, is not willing to give any plan of what will happen means that we are at a stalemate. We cannot win this war. The IDF keeps going back again and again to areas that it had already been in and then vacated because Hamas is moving in, because there's no other force there to take over. And the government does not decide on who would do it. And it's clearly the only other organization that can take over is the Palestinian Authority. And Netanyahu cannot allow that to happen because his coalition partners would immediately topple the government and he might end up in jail.
Yeah, it's an interesting messaging strategy to your enemy that give us our hostages and then we're still going to come kill you. What on earth is a possible incentive and keep bombing your area? Yeah. So one thing I heard from an American doctor who'd been in Gaza, and he was saying based on the injuries he was seeing, it seemed he thought some of the children were being intentionally targeted, and he was seeing like kids that had been gunned down by those drones with assault rifles on them, and some of the bullets were going in was kind of very questionable. We've seen UNICEF speak out on this. More kids have died in Gaza in the first, I believe, 4 months of the war than all wars combined worldwide over the last 4 years, which is just an insane number to kind of put your brain around. But do you think that's possible? There's kind of deliberate targeting of kids and kind of taking out the next generation, or is that just a general happening because there's kind of careless with the way the war is being executed in general?
Look, I mean, I've not seen evidence, and I'm sort of skeptical about deliberate targeting of kids. There's deliberate targeting of the civilian population. It's both because it's indiscriminate use of munitions. So we know of examples of dropping 2,000-pound bombs, and you probably know what a bomb like that can do. It destroys whole blocks.
Yeah, the radius of what
right?
they take out. Yeah.
And they drop that bomb, say, on a school where there might be 200 people or refugees there because the IDF told them to go there. And they drop the bomb because under that school there may be 2 or 3 or 4 Hamas operatives. That's a war crime. That is, by the letter, a war crime. So that has been happening a great deal. Secondly, as I said before, the deprivation of the population of clean water and food and medical help, targeted destruction of hospitals, also of universities, of schools, of mosques, clear intentional destruction of these structures, that obviously causes enormous numbers of civilian deaths. I doubt that children as such are being targeted, but one has to understand that half of the population of Gaza are under 18. So if large numbers of civilians are killed, the largest number would be children.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, just inevitably, it's a heavily densely populated area, and anything you're doing to the civilians, half that's going to be kids, without question. Yeah. So even before this war started, you've called out the way Palestinians are treated as being apartheid. Can you kind of dive into that and what your rationale is on that?
Yeah, and there's actually, I think today or a day ago, there's a new report in I think in the New York Times Magazine on issues that I'm aware of course, of what is happening on the West Bank. So the statement that some colleagues and I put out and was signed by close to, 3,000 people, I think, many scholars of Holocaust, genocide, Jewish history, talked about the fact that this was around the judicial overhaul, so-called, which was a judicial coup, an attempted judicial coup, really. So talked about the fact that this was not only a question of attacking the judicial system in Israel, but was intended to facilitate the annexation of all or most of the West Bank and the ethnic cleansing of its population. And that in the West Bank, there is a regime of genocide. And I think there is no question about the fact that on the West Bank, you have about 3 million Palestinians and well over 500,000 Jews. And they live under two entirely different legal systems. Jews live under Israeli law, although they're supposed to live under military law like the rest of the population, but they don't. They're extraterritorial Israeli citizens. Palestinians live under military law, which means that they can be arrested at any time. They can be kept in detention without trial for unlimited amounts of time. Children can be arrested and held in jail. They can be charged with crimes that they are not privy to, that their lawyers, if they are lucky enough to have lawyers, will not be shown for intelligence reasons. So they live quite apart from the Kafkaesque nature of it all, they live under a completely different system. There's roads that they cannot travel on. They are separated from their own lands. So this is clearly a system where there are two populations living in completely different universes, and increasingly the Jewish population is attacking the Palestinian population, destroying their fields, their olive trees, their houses, and more recently, since October 7th, many of the soldiers there are actually recruited from within the settler population. So they're settlers in uniform with arms, and they do whatever they like. And so this is both an apartheid situation and one of creeping ethnic cleansing, which, of course, is part of creeping annexation of that territory. Now, some people have said Israel as a whole is an apartheid regime. I don't agree with that right now. I don't think that is true. But what is true, and it's interesting, you can see that in that New York Times report, that the occupation, and that's what we were warning about, is occupying the rest of the country. The rules, the thinking, the mentality, the violence, the racism that are rampant on the West Bank are coming into proper Israel and are obviously threatening also the Jewish population in Israel, which was protesting between January and October 2023 to protect its own privileges. It wasn't protesting about what's happening to the Palestinians. It was protesting because it was afraid that its own democratic liberties would be taken away from it. And now the whole ethos of the occupation is coming to occupy the rest of the country.
What yeah, that's a good, challenging situation. And I guess what would be your advice to Americans? Because right now there is, and you hit it on the nail, this is a very different Israeli government than what some of the much more better ones in years past. But right now there's just definitely an attitude in the U.S. for like, we got to support Israel no matter what, they've been attacked, and kind of locked into that thinking. Is this sort of you hear all the analogy a lot of times of if your best friend's driving a car off a cliff and you're the passenger seat, you need to grab the wheel. And Israel's been through a very shocking situation, and they've got a bad government. Are we, as the U.S. and our leaders, are we helping the situation by keeping this, keeping the weapons flowing and letting, not holding Netanyahu more accountable? I guess. What's your take on, and what would be your message to Americans who are very supportive of Israel, but yeah.
Look, I mean, my message is that if you support Israel, and I do, I myself, as I said, I'm an Israeli citizen, I have family in Israel, I have many friends in Israel. If you support Israel, if you care about that country, you have to do everything you can to stop this war, stop this killing, and force Israel and the Palestinians to find a new political paradigm, to completely change the way things were done up to now. The Israeli government, for years under Netanyahu, claimed that it can manage the conflict with the Palestinians. It has failed abysmally in managing it, as we saw on October 7th. It has failed abysmally in trying to take over, destroy Hamas, as we have seen since then. This is not, you cannot resolve this conflict with tanks and bombs. You have to resolve it politically. And the only country that can have the kind of influence on Israel and on the Palestinians through its influence also on other Arab countries is the United States. It would have to do it together with other European countries. There are some very, very important European countries that also have a fair amount of influence in the region, but the United States has to lead in that, and it has not done it. The truth is that the administration has made some of the right noises, but for some reason, it has not put its foot down. And, in Israel, people say, well, the Palestinians only understand one language, it's the language of strength and power. The truth is that that's exactly the case of Israel. Israel is only conceded when it had no choice. Israel conceded the Sinai Peninsula after the War of 73 because it was such a bad war. Before the war, President Sadat of Egypt had proposed to have peace with Israel on condition that it would hand back the Sinai Peninsula. And Israeli political leaders, famously Moshe Dayan, the guy with the, with the cover on one eye, said it is better to have Sharm el-Sheikh, which is the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, without peace than have peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. And then when the war came, he said, oh, this is the end of the Third Temple. We are going to lose that war. And Israel had to have huge US help. And I remember it because we were getting equipment directly from the United States, M16s and whatever that we were getting at the time. The United States had to step in. So Israel responds to pressure, but there has to be a lot of pressure. You cannot say, I will maybe not give you a few bombs now because I don't want you to go to Rafah, but I'm going to give you $20 billion worth for next year. That doesn't work. You have to say, I'm closing the taps, you're getting nothing until you sit down and talk. The US can do it. The US can stop the war tomorrow, and it hasn't done it. And that is against the national interest not only of the United States, because the whole region can go haywire, it's very close to it, but it's against the national interest of Israel itself, whose government is now digging it deeper and deeper into a hole that it will be very difficult for it to extract itself from.
Professor, you have a book out on the subject as well as we wrap up here, Israel, Palestine, Lands and Peoples. And then you also have your latest book, I love the title of, the book, Butterfly and the Axe. You want to give a shout out for what both those cover?
Well, I mean, the first book that you mentioned is actually a collection of essays, and it's based on numerous workshops that I held at Brown with many Israeli and Palestinian scholars over the last few years, which to me showed that there is so much in common and so much to talk about if you create the right environment for it. There are many people, both sides, who really want to change this paradigm. But they have terrible political leaderships on both sides, Israel and the Palestinians. I published another book that just came out in August called Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, that tries to see the connections between these elements. But the last book that you mentioned is really about my own family, The Butterfly and the Axe. So that's a book that takes me back to my own indirect origins. My family came from Ukraine. My mother came from what was then Poland to Palestine in 1935, which is why I was born in Israel. And the rest of my family were all murdered. And shortly before she died, she told me about some members of the family that she faintly remembered. And I realized that they died without anybody recording their lives, their deaths. They were completely forgotten. And so I tried to write a novel that tries to reconstruct their lives and their deaths to the best extent that I could. Being an historian of that region, I knew a great deal about it, but I had no documentation on my own family's lives and murders.
It sounds incredibly interesting. I mean, that's great. And we'll include that in the show notes. We'll have the links to those books as well. Professor Bartov, I appreciate you joining us. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.